It's time for upgrades to Shocking Chevy. When the car was originally built, it had first generation Chevy Volt batteries and a Tesla base drive unit. Last summer we upgraded to second generation Chevy Volt batteries to pick up additional range. After fixing some damage from drag week, while testing the car, the base drive unit failed due to a coolant leak. That gave me the opportunity or excuse to switch over to a sport drive unit that I had picked up and planned on putting in the car. Before it goes in the car, we're going to do a couple upgrades to it, including adding a limited slip differential and modifying the cooling system to avoid the seal that fails on all of these large drive units.
Here comes the Electro Chevrolet. Paul Mangelsdorf, the 1940 Chevrolet Coupe. But it's moving pretty good on the top end. He's going to try to get around Fontaine. He does. 1265 for Mangelsdorf in the electrified 1940 Chevy. That's pretty awesome.
It's just a cool thing because I'm the gasoline forever guy, but I do not discourage this behavior.
Because this is still a budget build, instead of going with a full differential replacement, which are hard to find and over $2,000 typically, we're going to go with a LSD conversion kit from Traction Concepts. So essentially we're going to take this spring-loaded chunk of steel, it's going to go into the stock differential with a little bit of modification, and that way we'll save a considerable amount of money and still get limited slip out of the car. So the first thing I need to do to be able to open up the drive unit and get to the differential is to take off this orange cover here and remove the bolts from the 3 bus bars that run from the inverter over to the motor. Next, I've got to remove the plethora of bolts that run all the way around. I'm going to start with the ones down here while I've got it propped up, and then I'm going to set it back down on the table to finish up around the other way. Okay, now that I've gotten all of the bolts out, it's time to split the case. I do have to be a bit careful because the back side of the case here can only open about 1 inch before it starts putting tension on the thermistor wires that run from the motor over to the inverter side. I've chosen not to open up the inverter and disconnect it because I'm supposed to be able to split this case and get that out without doing it, but I may have to open this back up and release that if it's really giving me a hard time. So now that the bolts are all out, I should be able to just use an implement of persuasion and open up this case. And I am using a rubber implement of persuasion to not damage anything, but if you're pretty precise with the hammer, you can use a regular sledge too. At this point, I'm going to get a screwdriver. You want to be careful because there are coolant passages from the motor over to the inverter side, and the O-rings on them are very difficult to find. So there's one here, and I believe there's one down towards the bottom too. Like I mentioned, there is a wire running through here. There's also a couple locating dowels that will stay attached in there. You should also be careful not to mar the surface. At this point, some of the bearings here in the center are sort of holding the most pressure. And so they are letting the case rock around it. So you kind of got to just work it slowly. Go. So now that the case is open, we should be able to work this gear free and get to the differential. One thing that I hadn't seen in any of the instructions on this, there is a retaining ring in here that holds the diff in. So we're gonna have to remove some bolts on this side to get that out. We should be able to work this out now. So now that I've got the differential and the ring gear assembly out of the drive unit, I need to further disassemble it so that the new limited slip kit can go in here and I can modify a couple of the gears. The first thing I need to do is push out the retaining pin that runs through here, and that will let me get out the center of the differential, and that'll let me pull out the gears. And then I need to grind down the face of these two gears so that the new centerpiece can slide in and put it all back together and then stick it back in the drive unit. So I had to take a minute and figure out a few things off camera. The biggest challenge that I had was this bearing retaining ring couldn't get far enough out of the way to let me get the roll pin driver down in here. So what I ended up having to do is take one of the press fit bolts out so that I can then properly move this ring out of the way. That way I avoid having to pull the bearing, but I can still get in here and get this pin out. It took a minute to get the center bar out of the differential here. I was hammering in one direction, it got caught near the end, switched around, went the other way, and it popped right out. So what we need to do now is these two main gears that attach to the axle, the other's still sitting in here, we need to essentially face them both so that the limited slip piece will fit in, as well as to give this a larger surface area to mate to. So I'm going to get a bench grinder set up, going to cover up some of this stuff so it doesn't get metal grindings in it, and we'll get to that. Okay, so I've got a new belt sander set up here, and I've already taken some measurements front to back, did a quick test to make sure it will sand it properly, and now we're going to take this down at least to the level of the gears, check the measurement, do it with the other one, see if that's far enough, and keep working it very slowly until we've got them down to the thickness that they need to be. So now that we've gotten this ground down flat so that the center is even with the face of the teeth, I'm going to get these cleaned up with some brake clean before I start messing with the differential again and seeing if I've gone far enough or if we need to take these any further down. So what I need to do now is put the bottom and top gear back in and see if we can fit the limited slip device in between the two. And if we can, then we're good. And if not, I've got some more grinding to do. So starting with the lower one, there's a washer already in there. Put that on in. And then top one, we've got its washer here. Slide that on in, and looks like we still need to take a little bit more off. Okay, so where we are right now is that the two main drive gears have been machined down enough to fit the limited slip block, but the two outer gears need a little bit of work as well. I've already taken a little bit of material off and it's very close to slipping in there, but need to take a little bit more off, then we can get this fully assembled and back into the drive unit. Hopefully 8th time's the charm on this. So we've got those two main gears in there. Put that one in. And this one. Then rotate it into place. Check, yep, they're both aligned in there. We're going to put the pin in to hopefully hold everything in place. Now we're going to try once again to slip the limited slip block on in. It looks like this time it will go in nice and easy. Just what we're looking for. So now I should be able to run the center pin through. Might need a little bit of finagling. Okay. Looks like everything's through. It just needs to be driven into the far side. See if the mallet's enough. That looks like it should be a pretty straight shot for our dowel pin. Okay, it took me a minute to make a couple adjustments, but I've been able to get it to drive in a little farther. So we're going to finish up driving this dowel down and then punch it in with the dowel pin. Down a little bit further. Great. So now that that's all back together, we can put the bolt back in here and remove the retaining pins on those clips, and we'll be back in business. The instructions are a little vague about what I need to do, but I understand that this bar and the two pins that it are connected to need to come out before we install this into the drive unit. So I'm going to start just with some basic pliers and see if that gets it out, and if not, we'll look to larger implements. No luck on this side. Nor on this side. So what I'm going to try next is getting a screwdriver, see if I can get behind that bar and pop it out. That seems to be making a bit of progress. There we go. Well, that got the retaining bar out, and the pins just came out by hand. Let's see if this side goes as easily. There we go. So at this point, we've got the new limited slip section in there, and everything's buttoned back up. I am going to spray this down a little bit because there is some just grime on there from handling it so much. So I'm going to clean it off a bit, and then we're going to get it into the drive unit. Okay, so we're going to get started on reinserting this. So we've got to line up this retainer plate and line up the teeth of the gear to both the oil pump and the next gear that it connects to. So go. Getting that gearbox drive gear lined up was definitely an important part. Looks like we're all the way through and pretty well seated, so I'm going to start bolting in on the back side. Okay, so now we've got the modified differential back into the case with its retaining plate, everything back together. Now, before we line everything up and put it back together, I'm going to clean up the mating surface here of the gasket material. I'm going to get everything lined back up and then put another line of Permatex gasket maker along the mating surface, being careful not to get it into the coolant passageways, as well as not put too much on that it ends up in the case and interfering with the gears. But first, got to clean up what's there already, then we'll get everything lined up, and then we'll start putting some more back on and bolting everything back together. So I had to stop the time lapse for a minute while I wrestled with the motor. I could get one bearing lined up and not the other two, or two and not the last one, but took it back apart, put it back together, and now just working the bolts in. So I'm going to put the time lapse back on as I wrap this up. We got most of the bolts in, got a couple more to put in, and then we can finish tightening this up and have the drive unit back in one piece. The next thing we've got to do is reconnect the inverter to the motor by rebolting in these 3 bus bars. The washers on these are just barely small enough to fit through the hole. This one seems to be a little misaligned, but there. Took it a second there for that to catch. Okay, so the last thing then we have to do is put on the high voltage cover. It's got a couple O-rings and it's a bit of a tight fit, so it usually requires a bit of a tap with a hammer to seat down in there correctly. And then it's got two Torx bits that hold it in place. The last thing we need to do before we can move on to upgrades on the cooling system is get the gearbox refilled with oil. So I'm going to remove the upper drain plug here. There's a main drain here and a fill port here. I'm going to remove that and fill it up with some Dextron 6. So the next upgrade we're going to do for this new drive unit is to address what I've seen called the Achilles heel of the Tesla large drive unit. The large drive unit has cooling of both the outer stator as well as the inside of the rotor. And the seal on the end of the rotor shaft is what fails. When that fails, coolant can get through the motor, wreak havoc on bearings and the motor itself, and it can also seep through into the inverter side where it can short circuit things and destroy inverters. So there are replacement manifolds that the coolant on these enter here and split. Part goes down into the stator, part goes up here into the rotor, and then there is a relief tube over here into the gearbox where the coolant from the inverter is recollected and sent out of the drive unit. There are full replacement manifolds here that are really nice billet pieces, but they're pretty pricey. What I'm going to do here is use a kit from Kevin Erickson of EV Muscle Cars that he used and developed on Project Electrolyte that modifies the existing manifold and caps off this line so that the coolant just goes through the stator and over into the inverter, and we stop cooling the rotor. So far it looks like that's safe to do on these motors, so we're going to go ahead with it because the problems that can come from a leaking rotor seal are really not worth keeping the cooling of the rotor. So we're going to use this fitting here is going to replace the bottom of this manifold. We're going to cut the manifold off here, and then we're going to cap the bottom of it and remove this pipe capping each end with a couple of these pieces here so that we can try to catch this problem before it becomes a bigger one. So to pull this manifold off, we've got a whole lot of 10 mil bolts to pull off, starting with the coolant line and the encoder, and then we've got another 6 to pull off to get this manifold off so we can make some modifications. Okay, so I've just popped this free. I'm going to pull it on out. So this is the root of the problem. Coolant flows in through this tube to the far end of the rotor and then comes back out around the outside of it. And the seal between this end of the encoder wheel and this interface here, which would route coolant back up and out or down, that seal is what fails. And when that fails, it gets into here. It looks like we've had a bit of moisture in here. So we're going to clean this up before we put everything back together. I had been in here before to take a look at it, but it was a pretty quick look. So like I said, we're going to end up cutting this off here and rerouting the coolant to just enter here and eliminate this flyover tube, eliminate all the coolant in here so we don't have any further leaks. Okay, so I've got the manifold bolted down and my trusty Prius wrench. Yes, that is a roadkill reference. And we're going to get to cutting this hopefully neatly. That was fairly neat. I'm going to clean this up and then we'll get to plugging it. Got the end nice and cleaned up. This is the plug piece that's going to fit into here. It's a bit of a tight fit, so I may trim down the edges just a little bit so it slides in here easier. And then the instructions are to use RTV, but I do have some JB Weld here, and since this is not anything that needs to be removable, I'm going to use JB Weld to fill that in, get everything sealed up there. But I'm going to start by trimming that down a bit and then get to mixing up the JB Weld. And there we are, we got it all in there. It's all full of JB Weld. I'm going to let it dry on the drive unit. That way the JB Weld's staying down there and not getting up all into the rest of this. And now it's time to move on to the rest of the modifications. So the next thing, we're going to put a bit of gasket maker on this, get this on here, and then a little bit onto this and get this on here. There is an O-ring on here, but the recommendation is still to use some gasket sealer because that O-ring is very compressed. You might ask, weren't you wearing gloves earlier while using this? Yes, I was. I'm not now because I'm out of rubber gloves and taking a trip to the hardware store or to Harbor Freight to pick up some more would take a bunch of time, and so I'm going to just try to be careful. And because there's not fluid flowing in this set of gasket is less important, but I did want to just make sure it's watertight from anything that might have splashed up on it, because we do have the encoder there, and that's important to the function of the drive unit. For anyone that doesn't know, the encoder essentially tells the inverter where the motor is and how fast it's spinning so that it can figure out which phase to send power to. Now on to the hose flange. So I'll get those bolts ready. Get some sealant on here. May just put it directly onto here, that way we get exactly where we want it. It would help if I didn't throw bolts all over the place, but and this hose barb is a really nice TIG welded piece. As I mentioned before, there are some billet versions of this kit that use the stock hose location and connection, but this is a much more affordable route of getting the same results. Okay, now that we've got the manifold modified and back on and the new coolant fitting on, I'm going to get the encoder back in here and then we'll finish capping off the coolant lines. So I'm going to start with getting the encoder back into place. Here we go. So the last thing to do is to deal with this coolant drain line. This brings coolant up over and onto this side of the gearbox where it's all collected from the rotor, the stator, and the inverter. So the kit includes pieces that will essentially replace these blocks. We're going to reuse the O-ring on each one, but they'll bolt into those places and we can get rid of this tube since it's no longer necessary. Well, that wraps up the improvements to the drive unit itself. We've got a sport drive unit that now has limited slip and has eliminated the seal issue that plagues all of these Tesla large drive units. Next time we'll do some updates to the suspension to deal with the camber issue and get the drive unit in the car with some new adapter plates from Ampervolt.